In Titus 2, older women are commanded to teach what is good so they can help younger women love their husbands and children. On today's show, you'll hear from older women who will share timeless, relevant biblical wisdom and personal, profound life experiences to help answer your questions and teach what God says is good so you can be the wife and mother you were created to be. Welcome to another episode of Older Women Likewise.
Good evening. It's so good to be with you all tonight. You ladies, you can tell I'm not at home. We're at a resort in Crossville, Tennessee. It's a 2-story, so it's echoey, I'm sure. We're with some other Christians and for a golfing week. So it's really been wonderful, except for the rain that kind of messed up the golf part. But we've been with devotionals and singing and just really having a wonderful time being together. So it's been a joy. We're heading home tomorrow again. So, but I can tell you ladies are at home.
Yes, we are.
Very good. Doing well.
I'm at my beach house. Well, not very many people, I think, are wearing a heavy sweater in late July. But on the Oregon coast, we are usually anywhere from 30 to 40 degrees cooler than just 2 hours east in Portland. So I hunker down. After this, I may put on my ski cap and my heavy jacket and go sit on the porch and work. So
we're all jealous.
90s here, 90s here.
Oh yeah. So
what's going on with you, Dana?
Just busy summer life. We go to see our daughter and youngest son's family the end of next week in Atlanta, and I'm looking forward to that.
Oh,
yeah. Our youngest granddaughters they're twins. They turn 11 on the 4th, so we will be there for their birthday, which is a treat for us because we don't get to do that often.
Yeah.
And then the older sister is going to FC in a couple of weeks, so we get to share goodbye.
Nice.
So I'm looking forward to that.
That's wonderful. Yeah. That's wonderful. It would be great. Tonight we're talking about the joy of demonstrating genuine compassion. So, Cindy, you want to start us out?
Yes, I would. So I was thinking about when the great I Am passed in front of Moses on Mount Sinai at the giving of the 10 Commandments. While that was happening, Moses heard an audible proclamation that the Lord God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. So tonight we want to consider the joy found in the experience of giving and receiving this quality that God has, Deuteronomy 4:21, that he has granted his children the opportunity of imitating. And that is, of course, this quality of compassion. So someone has once noted that in Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:33 and 34, that this is the classic presentation of this truth, the lesson that Christians must respond compassionately to human need, not allowing their hearts to be hardened. Further, in Jesus's description of the judgment in Matthew 25:31 through 46, the prime criterion, this writer said, for division of the just from the unjust was whether or not their lives had been characterized by acts of compassion. So we're talking about a very important topic tonight, ladies. A lot rides on this. So I really thank you for joining me for this conversation. So the first thing that we want to consider is, what does God say about the value of showing compassion to one another? Dana, would you like to kick off our conversation here about your thoughts on that?
I would. As I was looking and researching for this, I just looked up some of the common Hebrew words for compassion, and one of the things that I think sometimes we try to define how mercy is different from compassion, is different from kindness. But if you go and you look up, for instance, two of them, Raham is how I'm going to say it, and Hesed, those mean having mercy. being compassionate, having tender affection for. And they are translated kind of interchangeably throughout the Old Testament. And, I think about Micah 6 and verse 8, it says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's what's good. And so to be compassionate is to be good in God's eyes, which goes along with what you were saying there. And when we talk about the value of being compassionate, I automatically think of those who are merciful God will be merciful to them. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. It's interesting, in Young's literal translation, it says, happy are the kind, because they find kindness. And Weymouth translation, which is an interesting translation if you ever look at it, it says, blessed are the compassionate, for they will receive compassion. So even in the New Testament, we see those terms used interchangeably.
Yes, that compassion is that motivation, and kindness is the expression of that exact thing. So I could see how it would be interchangeable like that. What were your thoughts on this question, Ila, of what does God say about the value of showing compassion to one another?
I thought of Galatians 6, verse 2, that tells us to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, that, we can't actually, take on. Compassion is different. Part of it is bearing one another's burdens. We can't do everything for that other person, but we certainly can show them that we care and that we're concerned for them, and that, we want to help them where we can to bear their burdens. And that's fulfilling the law of Christ. As we said, that's what God wants us to do. I always think that my first thought should be, how can I help? How can I help you? What can I do? How can I get help for you? I just think that, to me, that's the value of it, is that we help one another and we are helped by one another.
Good point, Ila. Yes, and to ask specifically the person, hey, I'm thinking about doing this to show you compassion. Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, please, what I actually need is you knock me up off a casserole. I actually need some space. I'm really journaling right now. Or, so sometimes the things we want to do might not be the thing that, is received in the same way that we offered it. So it's good, to check in and like, how can I show compassion for you in this situation? And if they're like, I have no idea, sometimes it's a huge loss and there's not much clarity there to be able to even know what you need. And so it might be, you could suggest this and that. Would you like me to take the children to the park for the evening so you can process, or whatever, whatever it is. One thought that I had on this was that compassion is an opportunity to show God how much you appreciate his own compassion in your life. If Jesus can sympathize with our weaknesses, though he never gave in to temptation when he was tempted in every respect, as we are, Hebrews 4:15, then we can, we who have sinned, we can sympathize with the weaknesses of others, even if those weaknesses are very much unlike our own weaknesses. Like, we've all had that experience of feeling weak, and that's an opportunity to help others who, by maybe compassionately showing them the way of escape that they may not be seeing. So there's so many ways of showing compassion. Sometimes that's it. Like, hey, have you considered this? This is the way of escape for the thing that really has you pinned down right now in life. So, and it shows God how much we appreciate his compassion. I'm curious, ladies, are there any situation in the scriptures where God said that compassion is actually inappropriate? And if so, what can we learn about how and when to show compassion? This is a tricky one.
A tricky one.
What are your thoughts on this, Dana?
I hesitantly want to use Matthew chapter 7 and verse 6, which says, "Do not give dogs what's holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." And that's the ESV. The NLT says, "Don't waste what's holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls and turn and attack you." And I think there are times that we try to be compassionate to people who are only going to turn that against us. And that's a tricky thing, because then am I judging them before I offer that compassion? And there we have to then talk about discernment and what, how do I discern? And, we're told not to judge lest, we be judged. And with what measure we judge is what we're going to be judged by. But, in John chapter 7, it says, "Don't be judged by appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." And Jesus was talking to the Pharisees there. And if you look at the context in verses 16 through 19 of chapter 7 in John, I think it's obvious that this is not judgmentalism, but as one writer I read says, this is moral discernment. And I think sometimes that's what, in this trickiness, is seeking to be right with God and seeking to do God's will, and then discerning if I'm not being self-centered, but trying to carefully decide, is this someone I can give compassion to? We all talk about people who stand on the corner and are begging. When we lived in Puerto Rico, there was a lot of that, and it's a very it is a very difficult thing for me. Do I give to them or I don't?
It's an individual,
And there were some that were so obviously drug addicts, and I didn't. My rule of thumb, whether this was right or wrong, was there was a place we went, and there was always this person in a wheelchair without any legs. I gave that person things, and I gave them because I was like, whether they've been into drugs, whether this person has problems. And I think we all have to pray about it and think deeply about when it's appropriate to be compassionate and when we need tough love. Anyway, that's my thoughts.
It looks like Debbie McCord is commenting, when we show compassion to quote unquote pigs and we are trampled, it does not make the compassion wasted. We did the right thing. We cannot be responsible for others' bad behavior or lack of thankfulness. So I think she makes a good point. You also make a good point, Dana. And I think the thing that can bring your thoughts together is that if you have shown compassion and they rip apart God and Christianity and you do it again and it happens again, and it's like, we got to know for sure who we're like you said, who we're talking to and what we're dealing with.
Right.
So,
and hey to Debbie McCord, because she's a very compassionate woman.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yes.
Beautiful. Well, I was thinking about on this that sometimes I think what I was thinking mostly about was false compassion. I think that we always show compassion. We always show compassion. We use discretion, because what you're talking about, Dana, is this really compassion? Because you don't want to contribute to the demise of a drug addict. That's compassionate. Right. You also, and so you're doing your best to discern all of that. So what I was kind of zoning into was really kind of like false compassion. And we can feel that when it's actually quite the opposite of compassion. And it actually can put souls at risk. So if I am blame shifting, for example, say I am blame shifting and I'm playing the part of an oppressed victim around my self-destructive behavior that God holds me entirely responsible for, if in that situation someone pats me on the head and says, poor soul, instead of quietly and humbly and compassionately empowering me with the truth on the matter, then they have certainly not been the one who has helped me have a happier future. So it's kind of like Proverbs 27:6 that says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of the enemy. So there are so many examples of false compassion. I think we also see it, some mothers are tempted to do too much for their children so that they are forever dependent on them. And this is quite unhealthy, because some, unfortunately, are like addicted to being needed. So this can be very self-serving, and it doesn't fulfill our primary objective to strengthen our children toward honorable and independent manhood and womanhood. So that feels like compassion, to just do everything for them like they're forever children. And it's really not compassion. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Another example, enabling people to stay addicted to self-destructive behaviors through maybe our financial support. Dana, I think that's exactly what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We must allow those that we love, here's the hardest part, those that we love to suffer some of the consequences of their rebellion so that pain can do what it was designed to do, and that is to move them back to God. It makes me wonder, like, how long would it have taken the prodigal to return to the father if that father was throwing him, like killing the fatted calf all the time, throwing him birthday parties, when he would come back and forth, or sending him care packages and stuff. No, he let pain do its work to draw him back to the Father.
Right.
I have a couple of other examples, but I want to hear what Ila says before I share those. Anything you wanted to add on this, Ila?
The passages that I thought of were 1 Peter 4, that says in verse 15, but let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody in other men's matters. And I think it's what you're saying. Here's someone who has broken the law and is suffering the consequence of it. And if we're like, oh, poor thing, you've just been so mistreated, they're just being so bad to you. And don't we see it with mom? I always call it mamas and their babies. Oh, my poor baby, he stole that. It wasn't his fault. They shouldn't have had it. I mean, I've heard them all. But if a person is suffering because of their bad behavior, their criminal activity or immoral, illegal activity, then showing them compassion, poor you, it isn't effective. I mean, it doesn't help them any. In other words, what they need is to be responsible for their actions. And the other one I thought of is 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10. This week, for even when we were with you, Paul says, with this we commanded you that if any would not work, neither should he eat. And that's tough love,
Yeah.
If we, like Dana was saying, I'm the same way when I see people. I don't know whether they're genuine or not. I prefer to show my compassion financially in that way to people that I have some confidence are genuinely in a needful situation, and that they aren't in this not working situation. They're not working because they can't work, not because they've just chosen not to. But that's tough love to not allow them to eat if they won't work. But that's what he says. So,
and to what Debbie Binderman, the one who to what she said, I think is a valid point, in that we all reach out to people at times who we assume, or we are taking a chance that they are deserving of compassion. And if they're not, then I've done what I'm supposed to do. and they will be judged by God. And I think that's a very valid point. I know for me, my funds, as far as financially, if we're talking, my funds are limited. So I have to choose who I can contribute money to. But I can always be kind to people.
That's right.
Oh, I love that point. I love that point. Yeah, there's more than one way to be kind.
Right.
You could hand a free Bible to anybody on the streets, and that's even more compassionate than handing them $1 or so yeah, I guess I just want to kind of tie that up a little bit, and let me know if you agree with this. Every woman needs to follow her conscience on this question, right? You guys have shared how some of the principles that you use to make decisions in this corner of your life. And if someone else's conscience is leading them another direction, that's what they should do. Could we agree on that?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. A couple more examples before we move on that I just feel are too important to skip. To the mothers raising young children, withholding discipline from a little one who is being rebellious can feel like compassion. But more often than not, it is actually them training you to tolerate antisocial behaviors that, if not corrected, will cause them really to be disliked in their future. You don't want that. You want a well-socialized child that every good person enjoys, and that happens when we do not withhold discipline from a child, even though it feels, and we need to have compassion during that discipline.
Yeah.
Very with the least amount of force necessary to accomplish the change of behavior. But that's a principle. And then I guess the last thing that I want to say on this is it's false compassion to side with men who have rejected the compassionate outreach of God, and their rebellion is being judged by him. So we need to have more compassion on God than we do on those who treat him with disdain. Think about this in Leviticus 10:6, when Aaron's sons rebelled against God, that he was not even supposed to tear his clothes, as was the custom for mourning that death. Because, my understanding of this is that by doing so, that would be a sign of loyalty to the sons over loyalty to God. So
I think Marsha Ray Patterson made a good comment along with what you were saying just a moment ago, that kind of compassion causes further maladaptive behaviors. You're not helping your child to learn how to behave and as a godly person by showing compassion in those situations.
Well, that's not even real compassion. That's not even, it makes us feel compassionate, but it's not real compassion.
Yeah.
Compassion is seeking what's good for the other person and doing what's kind and generous for the other person because we love them, and allowing them to fail is sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do.
Takes a lot of discretion, doesn't it, ladies? What kind of situation is this? And so we want to err on the side of compassion, but what is the most compassionate action in this situation on a deeper level, right?
Right.
So how does one become more empathetic and compassionate? Ila, what do you think on this one?
Wait a second. Let's see. I had one. Mindfulness. We're here today, like I said, with some other Christians, and so I told them yesterday. I said, y'all had to help me with this. So, the one word that was said was mindfulness. You can become more empathetic, and by just being mindful, just paying attention, be aware of what's going on around us. What are people saying? How are they looking? What are they doing? And just be aware and try to make a judgment in the sense of an evaluation of how are you today? Fine. Well, they're obviously not, but be mindful about that. I thought that was a really good one word, keep up, kind of a thing, keep doing.
A passage that came to my mind is Philippians 2:3-4, which I think just really fits with what you just said. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. That's what you just said by saying mindfulness. And I'm not thinking about me, but I'm thinking about you. And I think if we do that, and one of the other things I thought about is, sometimes my being vulnerable and sharing the realities in my life can show empathy and compassion to other people.
Anyway. Yeah, that they can now relate to you, and maybe if they're going through something similar, they can ask you specific questions about what you've gone through and that kind of thing. Yes, vulnerability kind of hurts. It's kind of scary sometimes, but that in itself is an act of compassion for sure. I was thinking about 1 John 3:17 that says, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So that the thought that I had around that was that I think the key to becoming more compassionate is not to close our hearts when we feel that first movement toward acting on our compassion. There's kind of this moment, right, where it's like, shouldn't I? I'm not sure. I think you were just speaking to that a moment ago. And so that question, are you okay? Or even I know Mark and I, one time we were sitting in the van, we do the van life. We live in a van for a good portion of the year. And we saw a couple and she was in meltdown mode and everything. When things had kind of slowed down a little bit, Mark walked up to her and handed her a copy of my book, Year for a Start, and said, we don't know what's going on. We don't need to know what's going on. Just know that we care. Just know that you're important. We see your pain and we're saying a quiet prayer for you. And so, being a little bit socially daring, I suppose. And the other thing is, Dana, something that you said made me think of this, is that sometimes it was very likely that they could have said, mind your own business. Like, so you can just kind of be ready to be attacked in exchange for your, and don't take that to heart too much. If that happens, then just try to move on and not take that, don't make that keep you from showing compassion for the next person, because it is a chance you take. And sometimes you get the opposite reaction.
When you ask the question, how do we become more empathetic? I think about, in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14, where Paul says the love of Christ, and the ESV says controls me.
Love that. Yeah.
It controls me. That we've concluded if Christ died first, then we've all died. And I think about that. If Christ is controlling me, then, you can go over to Romans chapter 12, where it talks about that we're to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And that whole chapter is about how we are real in our life with Christ, and how we love one another, and how we make verse 9, I think it is, says, let your love be genuine. And it just lists thing after thing after thing that could just feed right into this idea of being compassionate and being loving, caring, kind, compassionate people. And I encourage you to go over and read chapter 12 of Romans, because I think it's so powerful along this line. And if Christ is controlling me, if I'm allowing him to control my life, then chapter 12 of Romans is what my life should look like as a Christian.
Mm.
And I will be that kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Ila?
We were talking about empathy, and we want to become more empathetic. In order to have empathy for someone, I have to have experienced what they're experiencing. And the non-way of being empathetic is to say, "Oh, I know how you feel." You don't know how they feel. You know how you felt in a similar circumstance, but you don't really know how they feel. But to become more empathetic, you really have to become more self-aware. When we go through trauma, usually our first thought is, let me get rid of it, let me dismiss it and get it out of my life. But if I'm going to be empathetic with someone who is facing a similar trauma, then I need to be aware of my feelings, and I do need to be more evaluative or analytical or something. And another thing that was suggested was talk with others who have experienced this same kind of situation, with the view in mind of adding their experience to your experience to help a third person. And so that, as as you are learning more about what happens and how people feel in this circumstance, because the way I feel is not going to be the way you feel or the way you feel, but are even the very same experience. But I can work on becoming more empathetic to be able to, and I think in dealing with people, in showing empathy, quite often it's just a matter of sitting and listening. And Marcia says, Diane Hayes shares this with us, listen to what they say and what they don't say. And then Marcia says, sit and listen non-judgmentally. That just by practicing those things, I think we can become more empathetic.
Yeah.
I think one thing too that has maybe helped me, that might be useful to someone in our audience, is not to wait to feel it before you make the compassionate move.
Yeah.
Like sometimes the compassionate feeling actually follows the compassionate act. And I think we'll be more involved in compassionate acts if we act upon it and not necessarily be dependent on our feelings to cause us to move on it. To me, it's kind of interesting that a compassionate heart is something that I think, like just about every other virtue, it comes more naturally to some personality types than others, maybe. But regardless of whether or not you were born like with a bleeding heart, so to speak, in Colossians 3:12-13, God's chosen ones are told to make a choice in our lives to put on a compassionate heart like we would clothing. So even the least, let's say, emotional among us can be just as effectively and compassionately bearing one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So there is a place for you. However you express compassion, there is use for your abilities in that way. And as you go about the world, I think God will put in your path the very person. And sometimes, Ila, when you were talking, I was thinking about the value. I think you kind of touched on this. The value of almost, I'll just call it matchmaking, of like, say you hear a sister in Christ is, maybe she's pregnant with a baby that has a certain birth defect, or it's like, oh, I just met this other sister in Christ at this other congregation who's going through that same thing. And I guess sometimes we know the person that they would super relate to in a certain unusual circumstance, So, and it would be up to those two, if they would both be comfortable with that. But that can be something that would be an act of compassion.
Right.
So how might a parent instill compassion into the heart of his or her child? I'm just going to throw out a bunch of ideas here, ladies, real fast. And then I want to hear what you have to say. So I would say and I'm thinking like their youngest years, at the very beginning. Say you have even just a toddler, your child is 3 or 4. I would say it all starts with going gently through life And so these little creatures that cross their path, these creatures, an earthworm. I don't know what it is, but it's these little creatures that they pick up and they see as they're toddling along, of just taking care, being gentle. Let's be gentle and, merciful to these little creatures in our world. I would say that's a good place to start. Maybe as they get older, in every personal conflict, they're not getting along with this person or that person or a sibling, helping them to imagine how it would feel to be in the other one's shoes. Like when they're sad, you could say, I wonder if so and so felt like this when such and such was happening, helping them, because I think kids are born maybe not realizing that actually other people have feelings too. Like, what a shock, So, helping them realize as early as possible, everyone else has felt like you have felt. So I've got a few more ideas, but I want to hear what you think, Dana.
I think one of the things to me is being always being forgiving and kind to them.
Oh yes.
And not demanding perfection out of them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they are demanding it out of other people or don't see any flexibility, I think children so often see everything as black or white.
Yeah.
And teach them to see that there's a lot of gray in this world and we don't know the circumstances. And if I'm compassionate to them and gentle with them and forgiving with them, I can instill that in them to be that way with others.
That is so foundational. Love that.
Yeah.
What are you thinking, Ila?
I was thinking of having your children participate with you in your good works, and not, I mean, besides doing them, talk about them also. This is why we're doing that, and why, what do you think maybe that this, an elderly lady or gentleman, what do you think they might be feeling? And even ahead of time, if there are people you're going to visit, old brother so-and-so, is just say, brother, I'm bringing the children. Could you tell them how you feel? Just, and just kind of prime the pump a little ahead, because they'll listen, and that will make a bigger impact on the children than you telling them what that person feels. If they say, I've been sitting here lonely and and that is, I think that's a strong lesson with children.
Mm-hmm. I would also suggest
going along with that is taking them not only to our brethren, but taking them to homeless shelters and where hospitals and nursing homes where they see hurting, needy people.
Yes.
That does wonders for kids.
Sometimes there are opportunities for older teenagers to do service projects in a third world country. Now there is an eye opener, like, wow, you mean they can understand how not to take their blessings for granted. That can be a real eye opener and just a brain shift that could be very, very helpful towards growing compassion. And I would also suggest not unnecessarily exposing our children to human on human cruelty, entertainment that is not compassionate, but instead inspiring stories about people showing compassion for one another. Look for those. I know when I raised kids in the 80s and 90s, and it was the Chicken Soup for the Soul books were out. And she would read all of these, and there's websites that it's just kind of like good deed stories, And so those, instead of celebrating like an enemy's hurt, those kind of stories, Proverbs 24:17 says, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles. And so avoiding that kind of influence where it's like, ha, 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 he got what was coming to him and that kind of thing. But instead, being, I guess, responding to our enemies the way King David responded to Saul, I think is an inspiring example. The only other thing I'll throw in here is in the teen years that we can demonstrate how showing compassion does not mean being silent when we see someone that we can have a good influence on destroying themselves. Rather, compassion means loving the eternal souls of others even more than their feelings. And in any given moment, their feelings at any given moment, and saying the things that can help them help themselves. So, for example, saying that a behavior that God calls self-destructive, calling that self-destructive, that's not being judgmental. It's being compassionate, because some may call this judging, but if we are only repeating what the judge of all mankind has already said about a behavior, then this is that true judgment that Dana alluded to earlier. Judge with righteous judgment. John 7, was that right?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Yes, it's like Zechariah 7, 9, and 10 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgment, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart." So last question, ladies, that we're close with tonight. What were some of the times, Ila, in your life when you have been the most grateful for another's expression of compassion?
When my daughter had miscarriages, and I've not had miscarriage. I didn't have that experience. I mean, I felt compassion for her, obviously, and sympathy, but I was feeling sorry for myself too. But it was so wonderful for me, the compassion that others, both members of the church where we attended and people in the community, expressed such compassion for her and for us, because an entire family, an extended family as well, has that loss. And that was a wonderful thing. My dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the compassion of, again, the community, the school where I was working, and the church was, I mean, it just really helped buoy us up, and help us to keep going. Raising teenagers alone, when I, was raising those kids, the compassion of people at church that would invite us to dinner. And that seems like such a little thing, but, we usually invite what we call whole families, husband, wife, children, and all. And it was difficult. I mean, we were not pretty, we were pretty people, but, it was a little messy. But there was such compassion among our family, as well as among the church, to help us get through the rough times. And I mean, those are times that the compassion has meant so much to me.
How beautiful, Ila. I'm glad that you had that support. What are some of the times, Dana, in your life that you've been the most grateful for the expression of compassion to you?
I thought about when I was, and I said when I was young and foolish, and I remember there were those who were so understanding and kind and not judgmental, versus I also remember those who were so critical and derogatory, and the contrast was so great. And I think about it as a very, very young mother. I had one of my sons was, as we called him, a ringtail tutor. He was like 2 or 3 years old, and there was this brother at church, and he was a coach. His name was Hoot. I have no idea what the man's real name was. But called him Hoot, and he was a high school coach. And I remember him saying to me, and I was so embarrassed because he was just, it was just out of control, and I knew he was out of control. And he said, "He is going to be such a fine young man, and you will just have to learn to harness that energy without killing that spirit.
Mm.
I remember that so much.
Yes.
And that son of mine is an elder today. And I think about that brother, you know, whom I don't even know what his name was, except he was Hoot. That's a powerful thing. We need to show sympathy to kids and to young people.
Thank
And
you.
understanding. Another time that I think about that is so impactful for myself, but my whole family, is we lost a home in a hurricane when we were in the islands. We couldn't insure the house.
Wow.
The kind of house we had no insurance. We lost everything. And can I say everything? Everything. The towels dotted the hillside. I mean, everything. And within a week, brethren we didn't know existed had sent us help and prayers from everywhere, and people who knew about our situation who weren't even Christians.
Wow.
And there were so many who were so compassionate. And I remember the night of the hurricane, it went for 14 hours, and we were in the house, then we got out and went down into the valley to a neighbor's. That was as far as we could get. And I remember sitting awake, and God and I had a lot of arguments, and I had to work through a lot that night.
I bet.
But God had it all in control, and it was these amazing, compassionate people. And that is very powerful to me. Compassion is a powerful thing if we just reach out and help people, whether we know them or not. Yeah.
There's such a bonding element to it, right? Such a bonding element to it. A lot of my memories about being shown compassion overlap with what you've shared. I had medical bills disappear after we lost 2 full-term babies, and I don't know whatever happened to the medical bills. It's like we made the phone call, and they're like, yeah, there is no medical bill. And so that's a mystery to me. I don't get it. But somebody was very, very compassionate to us. I also think about, I woke up when I was turned on my 50th birthday. I woke up in a hospital because my mother was there, and she had all kinds of very serious medical problems. But I remember people drove several hours to come and support me during that time when I'm just sitting at the hospital day after day, week after week kind of thing. And then finally the people that attended my parents' memorials, some of them were close to my parents, but other ones were just there because they loved me. And so that was very moving. And I always think about you guys. I don't know if you remember Janice McDonald, Dana. I know Isla knows Janice, but Janice McDonald was the person that came on our program and talked about her food addiction and how she recovered from that. But she has prayed over me, like the kind of prayers that you go into your closet and you are crying your eyes out, and her praying over me when I lived in Oregon full time on the phone. I mean, that I'll never forget that. And now that we live actually on the same street now, and we didn't plan on that. That's a long story. But last winter, she brought me some ginger tea when I was under the weather, and I always think of her now. I'm kind of hooked on it now. I have that almost every day, and I think
I was going to say that's not very compassionate to me. I can't stand ginger.
Why is she bringing me this
That was ugly, wasn't it?
That's why you ask what people like.
Don't ever bring me ginger tea.
Okay,
I promise that, yes, I will just keep it at my house for sure. That's about all that I have for this program. So
next week we're going to be talking about. Well, let me see. We did Bible examples of compassion.
Yes.
And we really didn't finish because all of us had several of us that were had several to talk about. And one lady was not able to be with us. So we're just going to do it again. And new people, of course, that new examples from the Bible.
Yes.
And so we're going to do that next week on our program. So Let's see, we want to, I wanted to put in this comment, this conversation was so life-giving.
Oh,
And
how
I have to
thoughtful.
appreciate, I just think this subject was really a good choice.
Mhm.
I love all these different things that we're doing this year.
Mhm.
And I just think this has been really good to talk about, and I appreciate that comment as well. So, yeah, we'll end up with our month of talking about compassion with next week with some more Bible examples of compassion. So thank you so much, Dana, for being with us.
Good to be
Always a joy. Just
Joy to be with you.
absolutely always. So y'all take care, and we'll see you next week then.
God bless.
Bye-bye.